Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a case that really makes you think about how much our brains control our actions.
It's a fascinating question, right?
Yeah, it really is. And the case we're diving into today is the one of Steven Stano. His story was even featured on 48 Hours Mystery in an episode called Murder on His Mind.
Oh, wow. I remember that one.
So this takes place in South Carolina back in 2006. Stano was on trial, and not just for murder, but for like a whole string of violent crimes.
Yeah.
It's a case that had the whole community shaken.
Yeah, I bet. Cases like that tend to do that.
The really interesting part is that his defense team is saying he was insane when all this happened. And get this, they're using brain scan technology, which was really cutting edge back then, to try and prove it.
I mean, that's pretty groundbreaking for the time, to use that kind of evidence in court.
Right. So it all boils down to this question. Can a brain scan actually show us if someone is insane? And if it can, would that mean they aren't responsible for what they did?
It really gets to the heart of how we think about crime and punishment. Like, if it's our biology dictating our actions, what does that mean for free will? Those are some big, heavy questions this case forces us to confront.
Okay, well, let's get into the specifics of what happened. This whole thing starts in April of 2005 at the home of Laura Ling. It's a really tragic story, and the details we have come directly from Laura's daughter, who was there that night.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, it really is. To respect her privacy, we won't be using her name, but what she said in her testimony gives us a really clear and heartbreaking picture how everything went down.
So what happened?
Well, Stina was living with Laura at the time, so this wasn't some random attack. He was someone she knew and trusted. Her daughter described him as being incredibly calm throughout the whole ordeal.
Wow, that's even more chilling.
It really is. And sadly, it didn't stop there. He attacked Laura's daughter too, and basically left her for dead.
I can't even imagine to have to witness your own mother being attacked and then to be attacked yourself.
Yeah, it's just a horrifying situation all around. It's really incredible that she survived.
Okay, but so what happened next?
Well, Stanner didn't just leave. He stole Laura's car and her money and took off on this crazy cross-country trip.
He went on the run.
Yeah, but it's almost like it was some kind of twisted vacation for him.
Okay, hold on. That's really strange behavior after committing such brutal crimes.
Exactly. So he goes to Conway, South Carolina to see a guy named Henry Turner. Henry was actually both Stano's friend and business associate.
So maybe he thought he could get some help from Henry.
You would think so, right? But it doesn't play out that way at all. He makes up this story about his dad dying and asks Henry for support. They even share a meal together. And then, completely out of the blue, Stano shoots and kills Henry.
What? So now it's a double homicide?
Yep. Steals Henry's truck and some more cash and just keeps on going. You'd think by this point he'd be trying to lay low, but nope.
So he was just running around.
Basically. He makes a stop for happy hour in Columbia, South Carolina, then ends up in Augusta, Georgia during the Masters tournament.
The Masters. That's a pretty big event.
I know, right? And while he's there, he meets a woman named Dana Putnam. She obviously has no idea about any of this, and he manages to charm her. They spend the weekend together, going to parties, and even attending church.
That is so bizarre. This guy is a wanted fugitive for double homicide, and he's just casually attending church.
Right. It's like these two completely opposite sides of the same person. On the one hand, you have this brutal killer, and then on the other, he's acting like this charming, regular guy.
Makes you wonder what was really going on in his head.
Yeah, and here's the thing. This wasn't actually the first time Stano had been accused of violence against women. Before he ever met Laura Ling, he was with a woman named Elizabeth McClendon. And when she testified in court, she talked about this really disturbing incident that kind of foreshadowed what would happen to Laura.
Really? What happened?
Well, Elizabeth found out that Stano had been lying to her and stealing from her. So she confronted him and told him to move out. His reaction was terrifying. He tried to suffocate her, tied her up, and just left her there in the bathroom.
Oh my God. That's awful.
It's like a horrible premonition of the violence that would later happen with Laura and her daughter. This pattern of violence against women is a really important part of this story.
I mean, it definitely makes you think about his mental state. Was this just a series of choices he was making, or was there something deeper going on, something he couldn't control?
And that's where the whole brain scan evidence comes in. Stano's defense team actually used the results of a PET scan to try and argue that his brain, and specifically his orbital frontal lobe, was to blame for his actions.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. And risky, too. I mean, using brain imaging in court back in 2006, that was practically unheard of.
Yeah, it was a huge gamble. They were basically saying this part of his brain, the part that's supposed to control impulses and empathy, was the key to understanding why he became so violent. They even brought in this leading neuroscientist, Dr. Thomas Sacchi, to explain the scans to the jury.
So they were showing images of Stano's brain in court. That's pretty wild to think about.
Yeah, it was definitely a first. And Dr. Sacchi testified that the scans showed Stano had decreased activity in that orbital frontal lobe. He was arguing that this could explain why Stano seemed to lack impulse control and empathy. He basically said Stano was living on the edge of insanity.
So the defense was saying he couldn't help himself, that his brain was basically making him do these things.
Exactly. And that raises huge questions about how much free will we actually have. Like, if our brains can be responsible for our actions, what does that mean for the idea of personal responsibility?
That's a tough one to wrap your head around. Like, how do you hold someone accountable for something their brain is making them do?
I know. It's really heavy stuff. And of course, the prosecution definitely had something to say about all of this.
Yeah, I bet they did. I can't imagine they just took this brain scan evidence lying down.
So we left off with the prosecution pushing back against this idea that a brain scan could explain away Stano's crimes. They were calling it junk science and really hammering home this idea that Stano was a master manipulator. So with all of that going on, what did the jury ultimately decide?
Well, you got to remember, the jury was faced with a really difficult task, weighing all the scientific evidence against the incredibly emotional testimony from the victims' families. But ultimately, they didn't buy the insanity defense. They found Stano guilty of murder and rape.
Wow, so even with this, like groundbreaking brain scan evidence, they still held him responsible for his actions. It really makes you realize the impact of those personal stories.
Yeah.
The prosecution was right. He was a really good manipulator.
Yeah, this case really underscores that justice isn't only about facts and evidence. It's about real people, real lives that have been impacted by these horrific acts.
Speaking of impact, let's talk about Laura Ling and her daughter for a moment. Their stories are really at the center of this whole thing.
Absolutely. Laura's daughter, even after everything she went through, said she wanted to forgive Stano. She didn't want to let hate consume her.
That's incredible, after everything that happened to her.
It really speaks to the power of the human spirit to find a way to heal.
What about Laura's ex-husband, Chris Lang? He must have been dealing with so much pain and anger.
He has been really vocal about getting justice for Laura, and he really believes that Stano's whole insanity plea was just another attempt to avoid responsibility.
And it must have been incredibly hard for both of them to have to face Stano in court and relive all of those horrible events.
It takes immense strength and courage, and their bravery just highlights how the legal system, while important for achieving justice, it can't fully address the long and difficult process of healing for victims and their families.
Okay, so the jury found Stano guilty. But this wasn't just any trial. This was a death penalty case, which means they had to make another really heavy decision. What was the atmosphere like when they were waiting for that sentence?
You could really feel the tension in the room. It was like everyone knew that lives were literally hanging in the balance.
And what did they decide?
The jury sentenced Stano to death. They didn't believe that his brain abnormalities, even if they were real, were enough to excuse what he did.
It sounds like the jury really struggled with the whole thing. Do we know anything about how they reached that decision?
Yeah, a few of the jurors actually talked about their experience after the trial was over. They said that when it came to all the brain scan stuff, they felt both impressed by the science, but also a little bit lost and unsure.
I bet. All of that scientific jargon can be hard to follow.
They said it was just really hard to figure out how much weight to give the scientific evidence versus their own understanding of, human behavior.
I can only imagine what that must have been like for them.
But in the end, it sounds like what really resonated with them were the stories from the victims. They felt a strong sense of empathy for Laura and her daughter, and they were determined to hold Stano accountable for what he put them through.
This whole case brings up so many questions. Like, how much can we actually learn about someone's mental state from a brain scan? How reliable was this technology back in 2006?
That's the thing. It was a very new field back then. And honestly, even today, there's still so much we don't know about the brain and how exactly brain activity translates into behavior. The Stano case really pushed those questions to the forefront.
And it really makes you wonder, how would this play out today? With all the advances in technology, could Stano have had a better chance at convincing a jury he was insane?
It's hard to say for sure. The technology has come a long way. We can see the brain in much greater detail now, but the basic ethical and legal questions are still the same. Even if we could definitively prove that someone was biologically predisposed to violence, would that mean they shouldn't be held responsible?
Right, it kind of creates this paradox.
Yeah.
Like, where do you draw the line between biology and personal choice?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something that the courts are going to have to grapple with more and more as neuroscience continues to advance. The law operates in absolutes, right? Like guilty or not guilty, but science is all about shades of gray. It's rarely that clear-cut, especially when you're talking about something as complex as the human brain.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we deal with this gray area in a system that's built on black and white?
Well, that's what everyone is trying to figure out. We might have to rethink how our legal system works to better incorporate this new scientific evidence.
Sounds like this is just the beginning of a very long and complicated conversation.
Definitely. And as disturbing as it is, the Stano case has been really important in bringing all of this to light. It forces us to really think about those big questions like the nature of evil, the limits of free will, and what our justice system will look like in the future.
Okay, so we've talked about the crimes, the trial, the really controversial defense strategy, and the jury's decision. But what about the bigger picture? What can we learn from this case, and what does it tell us about the future of criminal justice?
I think the Stano case is like a landmark example of the issues we're going to face more and more as science and the law intersect. It shows us how difficult it is to determine if someone is truly culpable when you have evidence suggesting that their brain might be impaired. And it makes us re-examine some really fundamental ideas like free will and responsibility.
It's a lot to process, for sure. But this case really highlights the complexity of the human brain and those gray areas that exist in our legal system.
Exactly. And that's why people are still talking about the Stano case all these years later.
So for our listeners, what would you say is the most important thing to take away from all of this?
I think the big takeaway here is that this is just the beginning. As neuroscience keeps evolving, we're going to see more cases like this. Cases where the line between guilt, innocence, and responsibility gets blurrier. And we can't be afraid to have those tough conversations.
It's definitely something we need to be talking about. And cases like Stano's, well, they're what get those conversations started.
Exactly. It's about so much more than just one man and his crimes. It's about the future of our justice system and how we as a society are going to deal with this increasing intersection of law and neuroscience.
Well, we've definitely covered a lot of ground today. What did you think?
It's fascinating stuff, honestly. This case really makes you think about how much we still don't know about ourselves and what it means to be human.
It really does. So even with a guilty verdict and a death sentence, there's still so many unanswered questions. What about Stano himself? What was his reaction to all of this?
You know, even when he was facing the death penalty, Stano seemed strangely detached from it all. He seemed more interested in, what his brain could tell us about science than he was about the actual crimes he committed.
That's almost scarier than anything else. He could just separate himself from his actions that easily.
It does make you wonder about the disconnect between, a brain that might not be functioning typically and the capacity for real remorse or empathy.
Okay, so we've gone through everything. The crimes, the trial, this whole strategy of using brain scans, and the jury's decision. But now I'm curious about the bigger question. What can we learn from all of this? And how should this change the way we think about criminal justice moving forward?
Well, the Stano case is a perfect example of the kinds of problems we run into when science and the law collide. It shows just how hard it is to figure out if someone is truly to blame when there's evidence suggesting that their brain might be the problem. It forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about free will and personal responsibility.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, and that's exactly why the Stano case is still so relevant, even after all these years.
So for everyone listening, what's the one thing you want them to remember from this deep dive into the Stano case?
Don't shy away from the complexity of it all. We need to be willing to engage in these difficult conversations, because science is changing the way we understand human behavior, and that means we have to think differently about how we define responsibility and administer justice.
It's amazing how one story can open up so many questions and spark such important discussions. We've really gone deep into the details of Stano's crimes, the groundbreaking use of brain scans in his trial, and all the ethical questions this technology raises.
And hopefully we've given everyone something to really think about. It's not just about the facts of the case. It's about understanding how the human brain works and how science is going to continue to shape the future of law.
This has definitely been a deep dive. Thanks to everyone for joining us. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep diving deep. This whole case, it kind of makes you wonder, can we actually use science to explain something like evil?
It's a question people have been asking forever, but now we have neuroscience, and it's bringing a whole new perspective to the debate. The Stana case really shows how this is becoming less of a theoretical question and more of a real-world issue, especially in courts.
So where do you even start with something this complicated?
Well, you got to look at what we know about the brain, right? I
Huh.
mean, it's incredibly complex, and different parts of it are responsible for things like controlling our impulses, empathy, making decisions, and all sorts of things can affect how the brain develops. Genes, environment, even trauma.
So are you saying some people could be like predisposed to violence from the moment they're born?
That's the big question, and science doesn't have a clear answer yet. But we are seeing more and more evidence that certain brain abnormalities can be linked to violent behavior.
But, okay, even if someone's brain is like wired for violence, does that mean they're not responsible for what they do?
That's where things get really tricky. See, even if we could definitively prove that biology is a factor, it doesn't necessarily mean free will goes out the window. It just raises more questions, like how much control do we really have if our brains are influencing our behavior?
It's like a catch-22, right?
Yeah,
How do we decide where someone's biology ends and their choices begin?
exactly. And that's the challenge the legal system is up against. The law is all about clear-cut answers, right? Guilty or not guilty. But science, it's not like that. It's full of nuance. It's rare to have a simple answer, especially when you're talking about the human brain.
So how do we reconcile that? How do you take something that's full of gray areas and apply it to a system that's built on black and white?
That's what everyone's trying to figure out. As we learn more about the brain, we might have to completely rethink our legal frameworks to make room for this kind of scientific evidence.
Sounds like this is just the start of a very long conversation.
It is, and as messed up as it is, the Stano case has been really important for bringing these issues to the surface. It makes us confront these really uncomfortable questions about, like, what is evil? How much free will do we actually have? And what's going to happen to our justice system as we learn more?
What do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to remember about this case?
I think the Stano case shows us that we can't just ignore complicated issues. We have to be willing to have those tough conversations because science is changing how we see human behavior. And that means we have to change how we define responsibility and justice.
It's amazing how one story can make us rethink so much. We've looked at the details of the crimes, how they used brain scans in the trial, and all the ethical issues that come with that.
And hopefully it sparked some curiosity about how the brain works and how science is going to impact the law in the future.
This has been a truly deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and keep diving deep.